At a time when the partisan divide is at an all-time high in the United States, one rare consensus has been to contain China. And they're materializing that consensus by pushing forward the so-called Strategic Competition Act of 2021, which has been sent to the Senate floor for consideration on April the 21st. Once passed, will it become a guidebook for the Biden administration to counter China's influence, or more of a symbolic gesture? Should China be worried? For more, I'm joined by Goodrum, senior editor and columnist at China Daily, and Wang Cong, chief reporter at the Global Times. Welcome, gentlemen. Let me go to you first, Wang Cong. Many bills sometimes didn't even get to, the Senate floor. It died in the committees. This bill was passed 21-1. Is it all but certain that the bill will pass the Senate and then the House and then signed by Biden?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is quite a shock, right? This is probably the only achievement, only legislation that has been passed by this Senate or this U.S. Congress could be, because they can, as you noted, they cannot get anything else done. And with regard to this, I think, yes, the fact is that anti-China sentiment is very high. It's bipartisan. So I am sure that this will move very fastly, and it could even become a law very soon. However, also like you noted, this is more like a symbolic move to show that they're still functioning in otherwise very dysfunctional U.S. Congress or politics in general. So, but in terms of content, I think there's nothing in this bill that they has not done or said before. So I don't think, materialistically, it does not move anything, but we got to watch for this, where this leads us.
Well, Ian, do you agree with Wang Cong? He said that this bill basically contained everything that Biden and his predecessors have basically done, but did not specify. Is there anything new in this bill?
Not in particular in terms of anything groundbreaking. It does restate a lot of the things that have already been said. It does earmark about $650 million for increased military involvement in what the U.S. terms the Indo-Pacific region. It makes a few steps in that direction. There's a few $100 million earmarked for a countering Chinese influence fund and for local and international media to badmouth Belt and Road projects. So there is some spending. There is some dollar figure. There are some dollar figures in the bill, but a lot of it is the same rhetoric we've been hearing for several years from multiple administrations. So there is some truth to that. I would say also there is bipartisan consensus frequently when it comes to targeting and sanctioning countries that have the U.S. is designated as an enemy. There's quite a lot of bipartisan consensus when it comes to military spending and engaging in wars. So it's not strictly true that this is the only kind of bipartisan measure. When it comes to attacking countries that the U.S. doesn't like, there is plenty of agreement to be found on both sides of the aisle.
Well, Ian, this bill was voted 21 in favor of, and one person voted against it. Do we, by any chance, know who voted against it?
Yes, Rand Paul of Kentucky voted against it.
Wow. Why would you think he did that?
Well, Rand Paul is...
He's a Republican.
Coincidentally, we went... Yes, he's a Republican. Coincidentally, we went to the same high school. He several decades before I did, but we're from the same part of Texas.
Guy, right? Who spoke for what, 16 hours?
He's more of a libertarian. He doesn't like very much government spending on anything. So any suggestion of increased spending, he's against on principle. I wouldn't call him someone who has cooperation with China in mind. He's just a bit of a fanatical anti-government spending type, and so some of the provisions of the act he disagreed with and voted down. But he hasn't given a statement on this specific vote, so we don't know exactly why. That's just my best guess, knowing what I know about him and his background.
His physical considerations could well be. Wang Cong, let me go back to you. Bob Menendez, chairperson of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who introduced the act, said this. With this overwhelming bipartisan vote, he said, the Strategic Competition Act becomes the first of what we hope will be a cascade of legislative activity for our nation to finally meet the China challenge across every dimension of power, political, diplomatic, economic innovation, military, and even cultural. Do you look at this bill, if passed, as some legislation that is symbolic or more substantive, meaning there will be a organizing principle for Biden to go about dealing with China?
Well, look, for example, in terms of the content and what it actually plans to do, there's not much new. However, this is also very important because once this passed, it becomes a law and it becomes a catch-all, kind of a catch-all excuse to take any action against China. For example, they can, as the previous guest noted, they can take action, sanctions. They can, impose sanctions against China in all of those areas. So this could be a quite alarming trend, I would say, that they might follow up with specific actions, sanctions against China in those. Already in some of those content, they are trying to push a decoupling economically, technologically, and also they're trying to interfere with some of the education, people-to-people exchanges as well. So we have to watch that. Although this bill in itself is symbolic in content, it could be followed up with more concrete actions against China.
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight there. Ian, what do you think? I mean, do you think this bill, if passed, will be more symbolic than substantive, or will be, a legally binding principle that Biden abides by when dealing with China, really reducing the chances of U.S.-China cooperation going forward?
Well, it depends on implementation, of course. There's broad leverage in terms of what can actually be done to fulfill these mostly broad-based goals. But as was just said, there is latitude that the passage of this bill would create. It would give broad authority to engage in this kind of sanctioning and the kind of unilateral activity that the U.S. is so fond of imposing on sovereign nations. So certainly, it's a kind of wait and see situation now because we don't know what will be the actual tangible result. But there could be quite a few things we need to be looking out for and keeping an eye on, because this idea that the China and the U.S. should be cooperating on things like climate change, which is true, of course, absolutely, but it makes it a little difficult when at the same time that you're having these climate discussions, you're also passing this omnibus legislation talking about the malign influence of the Chinese state. It's very difficult to get things done that way. So certainly for the hawks on the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez being one of them, it is a very useful way to throw a monkey wrench into the works. If there's any suggestion or belief that there might be some softening of the stances, this is a way to kind of stoke the flames and keep those going.
Yeah, as we speak, actually, President Xi Jinping of China just spoke at the U.S.-led, a climate conference that was held in the U.S. President Xi addressed the conference virtually. He said a few things. Basically, he said countries should really show their responsibilities. Countries should not change their policies every single day. Don't renege on the previous promises. President Xi, addressing this virtual conference on climate held in the United States, also welcomed the role of the United States in rejoining the climate agreement, saying that there should be carbon neutrality efforts of China that will be achieved in 2060. It will take 30 years for China to go from carbon peak to carbon neutrality. 30 years, much less than the developed countries, the years that developed countries took to get there. Let's go back to this deal, the bill, potentially. Wang Cong, let's look at some specifics. Chairperson Bob Menendez said this piece of legislation addresses his top priority. It is confronting the Chinese Communist Party and its political influence across higher education institutions. He said CCP influence undermines freedom of speech and debate on U.S. campuses. Do you think that is a fair assessment?
Well, look, in order to pass this bill, they have to, they included some very overly glorified missions, about, spreading or standing up for freedom of speech and democratic values. However, this is nothing more than, I think, a political consideration for both sides to have something done with the guise of, a legislation against a so-called China challenge. But this does not help any, average Americans, U.S. businesses, because, this truth will speak for itself. China's cooperation with all these countries, including education, technology, economy, they are beneficial. That's why they can sustain. But they can put that in the bill. It sounds fine and politically correct in the U.S. political environment now, but it does not help and does not help anybody, I think.
Well, Ian, we just heard from the Chinese president addressing the climate conference held in Washington. What messages did you pick up? Do you think this very bill, if passed, will limit the potential of U.S.-China cooperation on climate?
Well, I think the U.S. wants to have it both ways. They want to be able to, with the one hand, say we want to do this, we want to help, and we want to cooperate on climate. But at the same time, we want to remind you that we're calling the shots here, and that if you are trying to suggest maybe a multilateral system of negotiation and cooperation, that's not in our interest as the U.S. We want to have unilateral so-called cooperation, and so it is a bit of a contradiction in terms. I think that does not diminish the value of cooperation on climate change, but there does need to be a very clear position that it's inconsistent and hypocritical to be engaging in this kind of political theater or substantive, not theater, and to make these kinds of claims and attacks and pass this kind of legislation while at the same time reaching out supposedly the hand of friendship. I don't know anybody who would enjoy or want a friendship with someone who, the minute that their back is turned, or not even when their back is turned, when they're fully in front of their face, starts bad-mouthing them and saying all kinds of negative things. So I hope it doesn't derail the potential for cooperation on climate, because this is an existential threat facing all of humanity. But it's reasonable to understand the trepidation with which and the concerns with which China vocalizes its objections and its reservations about certain types of cooperation with a country that does not appear to be acting in good faith, as we see with this and many other pieces of legislation.
Well, Wang Cong, in the bill, the word malign appears nearly a dozen of times, such as referring to China's malign influence, malign actor that is addressing the challenge of China, and also called China a malign, China's behaviors malign. One subtitle is even cited as the Countering Chinese Communist Party Malign Influence Act. What does the word mean in this context? I mean, what kind of mentality does it reflect?
Well, look, first of all, this word we've been heard so much. This is a very derogatory, description of what China as a whole country and its policies, its cooperation. It's pretty much an old new a Cold War era of narrative. What we're saying is, so basically, the U.S. now. Domestically, it cannot function as a country. Its political system is so divided and gridlocked that it cannot get anything done. However, to draw the playbook from the Cold War, that they have to find a target, right? The first, that they have to demonize the target and say all the bad things about that, and that word is what it's for. And then they will follow that up with their own political or business interest by passing laws like the one we're saying. So this is a Cold War mentality, and I think it's in a wrong time of history, because this is not a new Cold War as much as some people want to push it into. China is not Soviet Union as much as some people want to describe it as, because China is the second largest economy in the world that has been immersed itself into every aspect of the global economy and by extension the global life. And to push China off, this is just an impossible mission, and also it does not have any benefits to any country. So I think this is just a futile not a futile effort on their part.
Yeah, many would argue that the word malign itself is pretty vicious.